part of it has to do with the temper of the times, but I also think in a way it had to do with the stories, the novels, the movies that these people had seen as they were growing up. There was always a Svengali who could hold a watch in front of your face and then make you go out and leave your family and come home with me. Or a little pill you could drop into someone's drink that would make him behave in bizarre ways. So I think in a way they imbibed some of these fantasies and thought that what fiction writers could imagine, scientists could make real. And oddly enough, one of the unexpected results of MK Ultra was that it wound up fueling a whole new genre of movies and books that are all based on mind control. The Spotless Mind, the Bourne Identity, the Men in Black, they're all about manipulating people's minds, and many of these ideas come from MK Ultra. So a project that was fertilized by fantasies drawn from fiction ended up fertilizing a whole new genre of its own. Another really unexpected result of MK Ultra has to do with Gottlieb's favorite drug, LSD. He was totally fixated on and fascinated by LSD. By his own account, he took it more than 200 times himself. He was quite an expert. I used to imagine, the details of the experiments that he conducted are so bizarre. I haven't gone over them here because some of you still haven't had lunch, but they're very intense, the things that he did. And I used to wonder later, how did he conceive the extremes of combinations of drugs and other torments that he could inflict on people? Did he come up with these ideas while he was tripping? So I thought that was quite an insight. But when I was on Terry Gross, she asked me a question. I don't think it got onto the interview on the air. But this one was even more than I imagined. She said, could he have been tripping while he's actually watching the torments unfolding in front of him? This is more than I could even try to deal with. But Gottlieb was fascinated with the possibilities of LSD. And as one of his fellow chemists said, we thought it might be the key that could unlock the universe. This might be the mind-controlled drug. So, in 1953, Gottlieb persuaded the CIA to spend $240,000 to buy the entire world supply of LSD. He bought it from the chemical company in Switzerland that made it, which was happy to be rid of it, which had only caused them trouble, and he brought it to the United States. Now, he used some of it in these grotesque experiments that he administered in prisons in the US and at these secret detention centers abroad. But he also had another much less coercive use for it. He set up a couple of dummy foundations that posed as medical foundations. And these foundations then approached hospitals and clinics and said, we have a new drug that we want to test, and we'll pay you to test it on volunteers. It's a psychoactive drug, and we'll supply the drug free. So almost overnight, a new market grew up for research in this field, and university clinics and hospitals around the United States began putting little ads in newspapers saying, if you want to test a new psychoactive drug, we give you $10, and you come in, and then we write down your reactions. So who were among the very first people that came in to do this? One of the very first was Ken Kesey. He went on to write One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He loved it so much that he actually got a job in the hospital, which was the basis for the book. And the real reason he wanted the job, I now find out from researching this, was so he could steal the LSD from the medicine chest and bring it home and give it to all his friends. Allen Ginsberg took his first LSD in a Stanford University experiment, which, although he didn't know it at the time, was sponsored by Sidney Gottlieb. He was turned on by the CIA. Robert Hunter, the lyricist for the Grateful Dead, who brought the acid to the rest of the Grateful Dead and started the entire Grateful Dead LSD decades of traveling LSD circuses, got his first LSD in an experiment sponsored by Gottlieb. Later on, these people came to realize it, but it wasn't until 30 years later. Of course, they never knew the name Gottlieb, but they did understand that this had now been part of a CIA project. And I got a quote from John Lennon when he was asked about LSD. He said, "We must always remember to thank the CIA." It's really one of Gottlieb's most amazing legacies, because the irony is that the drug that Gottlieb thought would give the CIA the power to control people's minds actually wound up fueling a generational rebellion that was aimed at destroying everything the CIA stood for. Tim Leary is another product of Gottlieb. How did that happen? So Tim Leary's first interest in psychedelic drugs was sparked when he read an article that was published in Life magazine in 1957 about a couple of Americans who had gone to Mexico and found the magic mushroom. Now, he got so fascinated with this that he went to Mexico. And the magic mushroom was Tim Leary's first psychedelic experience long before LSD. He went there because he was riveted by the material in this article. What he couldn't have known and didn't figure out for decades is that that expedition was paid for by Sidney Gottlieb. That foundation that supported it and that resulted in the Life magazine article, that wasn't a real foundation. That was one of Gottlieb's conduits. So Tim Leary himself also later admitted that the CIA, as he put it, was responsible for the entire LSD phenomenon. That's definitely another unexpected result of Sidney Gottlieb's work. He's kind of an unwitting and unwilling godfather of our counterculture. So, as the 1960s drew to a close, 1950s drew to a close, and the 60s began, Gottlieb brought MK Ultra to an end with this conclusion that it didn't work. But since he was the chief chemist of the CIA, he had plenty of skills that were still going to be very useful to the agency. And that's when he became, as I use as the title of my book, the poisoner in chief. He was on what the CIA called the Health Alteration Committee. So in May of 1960, President Eisenhower told his close security advisors that he wanted Fidel Castro, as he put it, sawed off. The CIA then famously sent an emissary to Las Vegas to meet with a couple of famous gangsters and asked them to please shoot down Castro somewhere on the streets of Havana. They replied, more or less, "You've been watching too many movies. That's not the way to do a thing like this. The person would never get away. But you must have somebody at the CIA that makes poison, right? Why don't you get us some pills and maybe we can get them to Castro?" Well, again, neither of these gangsters knew the name Sidney Gottlieb, and the CIA guy who had come to meet them had also undoubtedly never heard of Sidney Gottlieb. He was a secret even inside the CIA. But sure enough, the CIA did have a poisoner. And it was Sidney Gottlieb, who then went on to make the box of the 50 poisoned Cohiba cigars, which you didn't even have to smoke. You just put your lips around one and then you die right away. Botulinum, that was one of Gottlieb's favorite poisons. I've become a little mini expert on toxic substances through writing this book. That didn't work. They couldn't get the cigars to Castro, so Gottlieb started manufacturing packages of what were called L pills. It's another phrase I learned from writing this book. L means lethal. They kill you. L pills were passed to people who were thought to have access to Castro. Obviously, none got close enough. Gottlieb even made a wetsuit, which was to be poisoned inside with a toxic fungus that would kind of eat away Castro's skin and kill him when he put it on. Surprise, he didn't ever put it on. Later that summer, Eisenhower ordered another assassination. That was the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the Prime Minister of the Congo. In this case, Gottlieb also prepared the poison, not just the poison, but a whole kit with the hypodermic syringe and the gloves and the face mask, and he carried it to the Congo to deliver it to the CIA station chief there, making him undoubtedly the only person who has ever carried government-issued poison from the U.S. to another country with the goal of assassinating the leader of that country. So Lumumba also was killed by another force before we were able to get the poison to him, but during this period, Gottlieb definitely solidified his reputation as poisoner-in-chief. Gottlieb was also responsible for creating suicide pills that were used by people on our side. If you saw that Bridge of Spies movie, you'll remember the scene where they show a silver dollar inside the silver dollar there's a pin. You can pull that pin out and touch your skin and you're dead in 15 seconds. That wasn't made up. I actually have a photo of the actual silver dollar with the pin in my book. And that pin was something called saxitoxin. How does it's so concentrated in the distillation that Gottlieb created that 1 gram can kill 5,000 people. And he got it from extracting minute amounts of toxin from thousands of Alaskan butter clams. That was the kind of work he was doing in his laboratory. At one point during Gottlieb's MK Ultra work, one of the chemists who worked with him became disillusioned and threatened to quit. This was taken as a huge security threat because the little group of chemists that worked on MK Ultra knew some of the deepest and darkest secrets of the Cold War. Soon after saying that he was thinking of quitting the CIA, that chemist Frank Olson went out a 13th floor hotel window to his death in New York City. It was originally described as the suicide of an Army scientist, which is not true. He wasn't an Army scientist, and later on it may well be not true either that it was a suicide. There's considerable indication now, as we have more evidence, that maybe he was helped out that window. So that gives you an idea of the extent to which Gottlieb's work was secret and how important the CIA considered it. Towards the end of his career, Gottlieb took on one of the most important jobs at the CIA. He became the head of what was then called the Technical Services Staff. That's the organization that makes all the gizmos, all the spy tools. He was the Q. If you've seen James Bond movies, that was Gottlieb. And the array of devices that he came up with was amazing. I saw one talk about the L pills. Here's one. We had an agent inside another, must have been the Soviet Union. We didn't find out for sure. A Russian, a Soviet, who was a spy, a traitor, working for us, and only wanted to work if he could have a suicide pill in case he was caught. So Gottlieb could make a suicide pill, but how do you take it? You can't tell your interrogator, "Excuse me, I've got something in my sock. I got to look for it." So he embedded the pill in a pair of eyeglasses, in the little hook that goes behind your ear, so the guy could pretend to be really nervous and sweating and chew on the end of his eyeglasses, and then he would fall over and die. It's the kind of thing that Gottlieb would come up with. So Gottlieb left the CIA in 1973. He was an ancillary casualty of the Watergate scandal, which brought down his mentor and protector, Richard Helms. He and Helms ordered all the MK Ultra documents destroyed, and he drove himself out to the archive to the depot in Warrenton, Virginia. And the protocol written by the archivist says that these 7 crates of documents were destroyed over my stated objections. But with that, a huge archive was lost. Gottlieb then went on to become the Gottlieb that he thought he always was, the good, compassionate humanitarian. He and his wife sold their house, and they decided to travel abroad and work as volunteers to help the poorest people in the world, the suffering. They were working at a hospital for leprosy patients in India. In 1975, when Gottlieb received a cable from the CIA General Counsel bearing the unwelcome news, somebody has figured out that you exist, and they want to talk to you. That somebody was the Church Committee that was investigating the CIA. And Gottlieb did have to testify twice. He was able to testify behind closed doors, and the questions he was asked were very gentle. The senators didn't know enough to ask him any serious questions. Nobody asked him, for example, did anybody die in your experiments, or did you ever conduct experiments outside the United States? Even basic questions like these were more than they knew. So most of what's in this book was unknown to senators at that time. So Gottlieb was able to escape without much publicity or blame. And then he sank back into the anonymity into which he was so accustomed. He got a degree in speech therapy so he could teach children who stuttered like he did. He volunteered at the hospice. He was living out near Vienna, Virginia. He was on the planning board. He acted in the local plays. Everybody that met him during that period has wonderful things to say about him. But he would never speak about MK Ultra. At one point, he was ambushed by a reporter who asked him about it, and he said, "That's in my past, and it's going to stay there." But, as I say at the end of my book, people who knew him in his last years say that he was tormented. Seymour Hersh, who went out to see him, told me he was racked with guilt. He was a broken man. If he had been Catholic, he would have gone to a monastery. Other people around him told us the same thing. A rabbi who got to know him said, speculated, maybe he was as puzzled by what he had done as we were when we began to find out about it. In the late 1990s, several lawsuits that had been going for years, many years, slowly began approaching Gottlieb. And finally, at the beginning of 1999, one of them was about to come to trial. Gottlieb was a named defendant in a suit filed by a guy whose life had been completely destroyed after he was fed LSD while he was in a cafe in Paris. He had hepatitis, and I now know that people with hepatitis have extreme reactions to LSD, which may have been exactly the reason why they chose this guy. Anyway, the lawsuit was about to begin, and Gottlieb was about to have to go in to do something unimaginable, which was appear in public and talk about this program, when at the beginning of 1999, he died. So I went to speak to the lawyer who had pursued this case for something like 17 years. And he told me, I'm sure Gottlieb committed suicide. He didn't want to have to face it. He fell on his sword rather than be the instrument by which the whole program in the CIA could have been so terribly effective. We don't know. There's just so many mysteries out there. You can just chalk that one up. Gottlieb was a very odd character. To say Jekyll and Hyde would not even begin to encompass his complexities. I think that Gottlieb speaks to us today in a couple of ways. Well, first of all, the techniques that he developed for how to break people became the progenitor of manuals that we used in Vietnam, later manuals that we used to hand out to police forces in Latin America, and they were later used in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. The techniques that they describe all go back to the original ideas that Gottlieb came up with about how you break a person by separating him from his environment, making him totally reliant on the interrogator, using drugs and other techniques to make him realize there's no sensory world outside the interrogator. That comes from Gottlieb. In a larger sense, commitment to a cause is always the best justification for committing immoral acts. Patriotism is the most transcendent, among the most transcendent of causes, so it's always a very seductive one. And at that period in the Cold War, a little bit like today, we were told the threats facing the United States are now so intense that for this temporary moment, we're going to have to put aside some of our nice ideals of ethics and morality. This is a very slippery slope. It allows you to lose sight of that very important human question: is there a limit to how much evil you can do in the pursuit of a good cause before the evil begins to outweigh the good? So Gottlieb was a bundle of contradictory archetypes. He was a creator and a destroyer. He was a gentle-hearted torturer. He was a person who served power, even though in many ways he was an outlaw. He and what he did are full of meaning for us today, and I think in the end I came away believing that trying to understand Gottlieb is a quite disturbing way of trying to understand ourselves. Okay, with that I think I'll stop and ask if you got any questions. Thank you.
You want us to go to the mic, or?
Please use the microphone.
Okay.
Afternoon. First of all, I really wanted to thank you. I've been reading about this MK Ultra stuff for a long time, and a lot of the people who do the research on it are just characterized as being nutcase, and you've really brought it into the mainstream, and I think you do a great public service. My question is really about the documentary existing records on MK Ultra. It's my understanding that when Helms told Gottlieb to get the records destroyed, that they were, but later some billing records were discovered, and that they showed hundreds of experimental programs, but I'm pretty hazy on that. Could you clarify?
Yes, so writing this biography is difficult because I had to piece together quite a bit, but you're absolutely correct. After Helms and Gottlieb destroyed all the documents, it was discovered that they actually had destroyed them all. And that's actually one of the great dreams of all archivists, that there's always some other copy out there of something. So the actual documents were never recovered, but you're right, a whole series of expense account reports were discovered during the Stansfield Turner, Jimmy Carter years. And they go through the 149 sub-projects through which Gottlieb administered MK Ultra. So those documents, which were released as a result of a Freedom of Information suit filed by the great researcher John Marks, are an important contributor to this story. In addition, one of Gottlieb's key operatives left a diary, which suddenly turned up in some obscure community college after his widow donated his papers. Some of the victims have come forward, but many of them, of course, either died or never realized that they were his victims. And in addition, I've tried to go out and do my own research. So I put this all together, and certainly those extra documents that we didn't know existed strongly contributed to this book.
I don't know if this does work. Just a light question. When John Frankenheimer did his book, or his movie, Manchurian Candidate, did he have any access to Gottlieb? I can't imagine he was speaking with Gottlieb, but did he have any inside knowledge, and does he come up in the book?
So the question was about the movie Manchurian Candidate. Of course, Frankenheimer, the director, and Richard Condon, the author of the book, had no idea that there was ever a person like Gottlieb. Nonetheless, they were caught up in the brainwashing idea, which was, as I said, originally promoted by a guy who worked for the CIA. But there's an interesting footnote about the movie, and I have this quote in my book. The movie came out, coincidentally, just around the time when the MK Ultra operatives were all coming to the conclusion that brainwashing is a myth. And one of these guys that I quote says, actually, it caused us a lot of problems, because for the first time, masses of Americans began to think that there really could be a Manchurian Candidate, and this was just at the moment when we privately had concluded that after 10 years of work, the answer was actually the opposite.
Hi, thank you very much for your book and your work. I have two questions kind of related. First of all, do you have a time of when MK Ultra actually ended, or did it ever really end? And two, did you ever come across any evidence that Jonestown and that whole terrible episode was linked to MK Ultra? There has been some evidence that I even as a journalist, I've even uncovered some evidence of strange things about how Jones got his people that went to Jonestown. But anyway, I was just wondering about those.
Okay, so the first question, when did MK Ultra end? You're right, it didn't. There was no official end date. It petered out. Some projects that were already underway were allowed to complete themselves, but by the early 60s it had ended. There's an opening date. There's a date when the memo is signed, but there's no closing date. And of course, some of the functions that MK Ultra involved were passed on to other projects and other pieces of the CIA. So I don't get into the Jonestown thing in my book. I don't get into Ted Kaczynski. I don't get into Sirhan. And the reason is that just my style of writing is I'm only writing about things that I know are true. I think these are great areas for speculation, and there's probably more than a little bit behind some of these. And I encourage other people to investigate them, but once other people are able to prove them, then I'm happy to include them.
I am, as you well, actually, the first time you mentioned Manchuria, I thought, I wonder if the Manchurian Candidate. So I had that question in mind, but you've answered that. But it raises another, perhaps even more obvious one. What are your plans for turning this into a movie or movies? And,
I thought you were going to say, what are my plans to keep myself safe now that the book is out?
Frank Sinatra's too old.
Yeah, so actually...
They're kind of related questions are, if it were to be done as a movie, would your preference be for it to be sort of be a documentary, a biographical documentary, or something either fictionalized based on, or what would...
I'd have to take some LSD before you come along. And I guess one great speculation would be, could be lying in bed and think, who's Gottlieb? Who's the right actor?
Right.
Tim Blake Nelson played him in the Wormwood documentary, and as I write in my book, nobody even knew what he looked like when in earlier times when the episodes of Gottlieb had been filmed. So yeah, I've had a few inquiries about whether it could be made into a film, but I've been writing enough books to know that a few inquiries doesn't produce much. But I think he's an ideal person through which to tell a bizarre story. And as one of the earlier questioners said, this is so close to the bizarre conspiracy edge that that's another reason I've tried to keep it strictly to the facts, because the facts alone are so bizarre. And I think it does lend itself to film. On the other hand, every writer of every book thinks that his book lends itself to film, so I put myself in good company.
One of the top CIA people stood where you're standing recently and defended torture at Guantanamo. And he said we were getting pressure and we couldn't think of anything else except torture. That was the culture. We had to do something, and that was all we could think of. So is anybody organizing seriously to abolish the CIA?
Since you said seriously, I think I'm going to have to say no. The CIA has changed so much from the agency that it was then. It really was a covert action agency. Now it's a huge worldwide killing machine that wages its own wars. This was never the idea of what the CIA was supposed to do. And of course the CIA was the dominant intelligence agency. It didn't comprise the entire intelligence community, but you might have been forgiven for thinking that it did. Now it's just one among a large number of agencies competing for bureaucratic turf. So I must say that when I was working on this book, I didn't find too much resistance from the CIA. And I think the reason is that they're following the explanation that William Colby, a later director of the CIA, gave to the family of Frank Olson, the guy that went out the window in New York. He said, a lot of people, some of our people were out of control in those days. There was a lack of supervision. This is the perfect explanation. It was one guy, we weren't really watching, and he went off and did kind of crazy things. Boys will be the boys, but let's not focus on it too much. So I think that does show you a desire to want to escape institutional responsibility. And I'm hoping that one thing this book does is reinforce the idea that institutions do have continuing amounts of responsibility and need to be able to face these things.
May I follow up on that? Ewan Cameron, are you familiar with the name?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. What was his relation to Sidney Gottlieb? What was his relation, or what propulsed him through the institutions of psychology?
So the question was about a doctor named Ewan Cameron. He conducted some of the most grotesque MK-Ultra experiments. He was an MK-Ultra contractor who worked principally in Canada at McGill University. And we have stories of some of the most horrific things that went on under his supervision. So he's certainly a figure in this book. There's a little footnote about Ewan Cameron. So one of the one of his victims was a woman who came to him for normal psychiatric treatment for what I think was postpartum depression, and wound up being caught in this terrible web and subjected to these awful experiments where she was locked in essentially a coffin for days with headphones that's repeated tens of thousands of times, little phrases like, my mother hates me, my mother hates me, my mother hates me, lights flashing, drugs being fed in. It really, she later wound up, her husband was a member of parliament, which is why this story then got traction. For the rest of her life, she couldn't hold her silverware, she couldn't recognize her relatives. Her granddaughter is an artist in Canada and has done a whole series of works based on what happened to her grandmother. And one of them is actually the last picture in my in the photo insert of my book.
Now he was promoted though to the he was the head of the psychiatry
Absolutely.
for North
Ewan
America.
Cameron was the president of the American Psychiatric Association. A lot of these people that Gottlieb worked with were the main figures in their fields. He was the man funding research by the titans in psychology, biochemistry. Some knew that they were being funded by the CIA, some didn't.
But he was under an official sanction. Now, is there evidence that the CIA promoted him to that position, that senior position within the psychiatry? Is it safe to assume that?
I don't think the CIA would have had to promote Ewan Cameron because he was considered to be such a cutting-edge scientist. Everything I read about him, of what people thought about him in those days, is totally different from the reality of what he was doing. They thought he was a great researcher and a pioneer. So
his own staff
If we
avoided him
could please
though.
come to, we've got a lot
okay,
of people on
okay,
microphones,
all right.
so-
Let's go to the next question.
Okay, thanks. So you talked about how the LSD experiments influenced the culture with these cultural figures who were the test subjects. And I was wondering if you found evidence. I've been researching women in the Eisenhower administration, and I know Claire Booth Luce took LSD around that time. I was wondering if you noticed at that time that the CIA had all this LSD. Were they giving it to people in government? Was it influencing people in positions of power as well, like on the sly, like try this out, sort of thing?
Mary Brooks is a name.
JFK did too, didn't he?
Well, you're right about Claire Booth Luce, the wife of the publisher of Time magazine, which was, of course, leading the campaign against psychoactive drugs. Yeah, she used LSD. So did Cary Grant. And their LSD use is going to be the subject of a musical on Broadway this spring, written by James Lapine, the guy that works with Stephen Sondheim. It's going to be a big deal. Tripping in the Park or something like that. Esther Williams was another one. The swimmer turned actress was another woman who was involved in early LSD experiments. They, a lot of them got their LSD from a doctor in New York who was Sidney Gottlieb's favorite doctor. He was the one who was the most obsessed with LSD. I didn't find any indications that people in those circles had the idea of giving LSD to people in government. However, you may know that Mary Meyer, who was one of the mistresses of President Kennedy, had apparently taken LSD and had apparently told Tim Leary, I have a very powerful friend and I want to give him this. And actually she had the fantasy that all world leaders should take LSD and then the world would be a nicer place. That was even beyond anything that Gottlieb, I think, could imagine.
How